World War II, a time in which fighting and death were known all too well. In the seas surrounding Japan, air battles, as well as kamikaze fights of ship versus plane, were also a common sight. The American Navy fought long and hard to win this section of the war, along with the help of naval pilots. One of these pilots was Charles Downey. Chuck was a member of the USS Essex, as well as being awarded with the title of the youngest naval pilot in World War II. This is his story.
See, I was kind of air-minded from about age 7 or so on, building model airplanes out of wood, balsa wood. And it was like, it was like the hobby. I was never heavy in sports, so, but it was kept you busy. So, in 1927, I was 30 months, and my parents were having a big party. They were drinking bootleg booze, and 1927, there was a big event going on, and this little guy was about this high, and there was a radio about this high, and they let me stay up at this party, but I'm glued to this radio. It was kind of static, smelly battery, called the Atwater Kent radio. But at the time, I didn't know what it was all about. It's only years later I figured, well, the big event was Charles Lindbergh going by himself to fly across the ocean from New York to Paris. That was a big deal back then. Now you can be from New York to Paris in about 5 or 6 hours and it's nothing. But back then it was a big, big deal. So he wound up being an international hero.
From that day on, Chuck was inspired and decided that he would follow in Charles Lindbergh's footsteps and become a pilot. Lindbergh, however, was not the only influential person in Chuck's life.
And lo and behold, at age 15, there had a big aviation annual model airplane meet in Hartford, in Connecticut each year, and usually it was right at the state capitol in Hartford. It had an airfield. Well, the headquarters for Pratt & Whitney Aircraft, Hamilton Standard Propeller, Chancellorsville were all in East Hartford, Connecticut. They had their own flying field there, named after one of the executives. Like his name was Harry Rentschler. So Rentschler Field is where they conducted this 2-day affair. Well, I put in for solid scale, rise off ground, stick, but I could never afford a gas model, so I put in for 3 of them. I wound up with 3 trophies awarded to me by none other than Igor Sikorsky.
Igor Sikorsky was a famous airplane designer from Russia who was responsible for creating some of the most influential plane designs of not only his time, but of many years to come. He also went on to create the first ever single-propeller helicopter. Both of these men gave so much to the world of aviation, as well as being an inspiration to Chuck for the rest of his life.
So we're down at this airport one day in Hartford, Connecticut, cold, windy October afternoon, bright and sunny, but cool. And my mother knew I always wanted to go for an airplane ride, but my father kind of frowned upon it. Well, my father and my sister were somewhere else. There were some military airplanes down. It's kind of like an open house. But she said to me, "Come on, Charles, let's go off. Let's." So she dug into her piggy bank somewhere. I think for $5, the 2 of us went for an airplane ride in a biplane, 2 wings, open cockpit. Pilot sat in the back. With a little door on the side, we climbed up, and it was kind of cold and windy. So soon we roared off, went around Hartford, Connecticut, which is on the Connecticut River. So we'd fly around the city. We're probably going maybe not even 10 minutes. But my father was, when he heard about it, he was just upset. You could tell there was a lot of frost in the air because he was very unhappy with her just breaking off, because obviously had she asked him, he would have said no. So we sneaked off, and she took the heat for that. But I had it was an enjoyable flight. But it kept me, it wasn't like I needed to start flying. I was always interested in, but I built a lot of models. So as I grew up, I became more expert at model building.
This interest in flying and aviation remained with Chuck until he reached his high school years when the Second World War was beginning.
This is back in 1941, and because Pearl Harbor was 41, and we were all in that, we all knew a graduating class of 42 would be all going to war, everybody that's physically able. And they even said about Christmas time, right after Pearl Harbor, that any high school, any senior, we would waive his, if he wished to join the military, he would waive going through the end of the year. If he wanted to go in the military, it would be like we'd sign you off as having graduated from high school. So some of my buddies went in, and before I got out of high school, one of them was killed. I thought, holy smokes. So that's what you did. You went to war. No questions. You volunteered. We were all plunged into the crucible of war at tender ages. I mean, I've met young people in my war that lied about their ages. Like they got in when they're 16 when you had to be 17 or even 15.
After being exposed to life on the home front during the beginning of the war and watching some of his own friends go overseas, Chuck knew that at some point he would become involved in the war as well.
But I didn't have a great craving. I knew it just didn't happen that way. It was, I knew I wanted to be a mechanic on an aircraft carrier. And the Navy said, no, we think you got more skill level. Because I had all this background in aviation building models. So I was then kind of steered into naval aviation.
Because of Chuck's experience with aviation, he was enlisted as a naval pilot. Soon, he began training and learning how to land on a moving carrier ship.
You learn to fly on a land. You have a marked area. You try to simulate on land what you're going to do on the ship. You paint an outline on a runway, and usually you come into an airport, you get a clearance, or it doesn't matter. You line up parallel to the runway in the direction opposite that you're going to land. The ship is doing the same thing. The ship is just like a moving runway. But you learn to land on land first, 100 times at least.
After perfecting landing on land, Chuck began learning how to land on vessels in the water.
There were two converted steam, pleasure steam vessels, side wheelers, doesn't matter. All that I remember is, and I've talked about these, and I know you had the Sabre and the Wolverine. They were like 500 feet long, about maybe 40, about maybe 50 feet wide. What was different, they were way down near the water. They were 26, the deck was 26 feet off the water, which is dangerously close to the water. If you're in a steep turn, you can hook a wing and you're dead. Some guys have done that, but the idea was to not hit the water. But you're always flying at a level higher than the deck, at a prescribed level. Now, on the regular carriage, which were 85 feet above the water, we would be on the downwind leg approximately 150 feet above the water. So 150 feet, so you're going to be about maybe 80 feet above the level of the deck, making your turn all the way around. So you visualize that training to become a carrier pilot is quite routine, but you got to be very precise, and you fly down a path. It could be any kind of a path, and you do all your landing 100 times, at least 100, probably 8, maybe 12 flights, 8 or 10 landings a piece, whatever, approximately that many.
Chuck completed all of his training and was finally ready to go off to war. He, however, was not aware of what was coming in the near future.
All of a sudden, this huge explosion. I mean, vroom, and the whole ship shakes, and it was a big ship. It's 800 feet long. Well, what happened?
Throughout World War II, kamikaze divers were used by the Japanese to fly into American ships in an attempt to kill American soldiers. These kamikazes were also known as suicide divers because their job would always result in their instant death. The Ticonderoga is one of the hundreds of ships harmed by the destructive kamikazes.
In my case, I was fortunate. I've seen a lot of body parts. We got kamikaze. You know, the Japanese, near the end, were just decimating their young people. They weren't very well trained. They were just trained to fly out and follow a leader and then crash into a ship. So it was pretty grisly.
On January 21, 1945, after taking part in raids against the Japanese in Indochina, China, Luzon, and Formosa, the Ticonderoga was hit by 2 kamikaze suicide planes.
And the day we got hit on the carrier, Ticonderoga, all of a sudden you weren't expecting it, and a guy crashes into your flight deck.
Chuck was lucky enough to escape the wrath of the destructive first kamikaze. When the plane hit, he and 12 others were positioned in a ready room preparing for their flight that afternoon.
So we're all in the ready room, waiting, getting ready. First flight come back. So the afternoon strike is ready to go out. So we're sitting in the ready room, and all of a sudden, 40-millimeter weapons are heard from our ship. Normally, we're the most protected vessel in the whole fleet. Guns never go off on your own ship. You have them in case. Well, 40's going off, say, hey, somebody's coming at us. Normally, the surrounding destroyers and cruisers protect the main carrier force. Well, apparently a few got through beyond their screen, so we're now defending ourselves with 40 millimeters. So we hear this 40 millimeters going off. Well, let's go see what's going on outside. So I'm reaching up, we stand up on our chairs, get up on the overhead, they're hanging from girders. Going to get your heart rate and go outside and see what's going on. And I'm standing up, other guys doing the same thing. All of a sudden, there's a huge explosion. I mean, vroom, and the whole ship shakes, and it was a big ship. It's 800 feet long. Well, what happened? They had some wag up in the front says, well, I think we've been hit, guys. Well, it was obvious it was a big commotion. So the air is full of smoke, no flame, but smoke. So we're having trouble seeing. So we said, we better we're in a bad situation. Fire on the other side of the door in both cases. So we're left in the ready room. There's a senior officer, non-flying officer. Says, fellas, he's a southern gentleman from Atlanta, Georgia. He said, fellas, y'all listen up now. Get your gas masks on, else we're going to die in this ready room. You don't want to do that. Now let's get the gas masks on. And then one of you, I'll lead out of here once I find out the best way out.
Chuck and the others successfully made it to the deck of the ship where they were able to see the damage taken by the Ticonderoga from the kamikaze. After successfully making it to the deck, Chuck and other pilots began to prepare for their flight.
So I thought, well, I better go get in the airplane in case they launches. I had no helmet. I don't recall having, my hard hat was, I had nothing. I just had a gas mask. So now I'm observing there's firing going on. There's still a kamikaze or something up there, silver flashing around. A lot of people shooting at him. Not necessarily our ship, but cruisers. So I get out. Finally decide, what am I doing in this airplane? So I'm thinking, well, why don't you get out of the airplane, go somewhere else. It's too dangerous up here. So it was like recovering from the effect of one kamikaze hit. Ship's on fire. It's under control by now. This is like 30 minutes later.
Chuck decides that the best decision is to find a safe place to wait while the fiery mess cools down on the deck. He finds reclusion in a nearby gun tub with 6 other sailors.
So there's a 20 millimeter gun tub right about opposite where my airplane was. Then remember, no, I'm all alone. Other airplanes are there, other guys are around, other pilots. But I get down in the gun tub, there's 6 Marines, there's 6 weapons, 2 Marines per weapon, 20 millimeters, that are used if in case somebody's like right in front of you. Well, they didn't get there, they were poised, but I got down in the gun tub with them, and I watched the demise of the second Kamikaze.
Once Chuck finds an escape from the chaotic deck, he later learns that there were a total of 5 kamikazes near his ship that day, but luckily nearby destroyers were able to take down the other 3 before they could reach the Ticonderoga or other ships.
But the second of the 2 that hit was still flying around about 1,500 feet, and I could see him, and he decided to make up his mind and head for our ship. And the kamikazes were instructed to hit the flight deck. Well, he already knew that somebody hit the flight deck and punched a hole in it, so he figured he'd come in. But he did, as a kamikaze, he wasn't too bright, because he hit above the flight deck and hit a steel control center, by 2 men inside. Well, he hits this thing 90 degrees, and I observed it from being in the gun tub, but he hit it high enough, his explosion went not into the ship, but across the flight deck, because I witnessed that from astern. I saw him hit, looking up alongside the ship. He was 350 feet up from me, but, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. I knew he wasn't going to come way back where I was. If he did, I'd have been dead. Well, I was scared. I was lucky because we lost over 200 men killed and a whole bunch wounded. It was a pretty grisly affair. Well, we saved the ship, but a whole bunch of airplanes were destroyed. Well, he hit us. We got caught with our pants down. It was about that simple.
In total, over 140 crew members lost their lives, with 100 more being severely injured. Throughout all of World War II, over 7,450 kamikazes flew to their deaths. With this, 120 U.S. ships were sunk, with many more being severely damaged. In total, 3,048 Allied sailors were killed and another 6,025 were wounded. The kamikazes hitting his ship was not the only traumatic occurrence that Chuck would experience throughout his time in the Navy.
War is hell. It's especially in the Navy, because you're just on the ship all the time. You're not seeing any port. You're away from the ship. Where you're going, they're angry with you. They're shooting at you. So you just tough it out and hope you make it. Here I am. So you could piece all this together. We were up there on the 17th. About the 21st, I think, was a few days later. Now, we were there to strike, render the Japanese airfields and airplanes associated with it, do as much damage as we could so they wouldn't come down and attack the Marines landing at Iwo Jima. That's why we were up there. It's kind of scary. I was above Fujisan, which is 14,000 feet, and they're shooting at us. And in the ready room, I said to the guys, we're just going to strike an airfield, not going after a 35-foot destroyer, which is about, destroyer is only about as wide as this room. It's probably about 35, 40, no, that's as wide as a destroyer. Well, a hangar is probably going to be a couple hundred feet. So I said, why not, instead of putting our dive brakes down, slowing us down, which is pretty good, but if we can't hit, by this time, what kind of dive bombers are, if we can't hit a target, just going like crazy, and speed is life. Here we are going over the homeland. If we got shot down or landed, we're going to get our heads cut off, because that's the way it was up there. We learned that from, so let's get in and get out in a hurry, because once you're over water, you're kind of safe. So sure enough, I went down without my flaps, and I blew up a hangar, and it was like, but the part of the war that was, our air group, our fighter squadron, one fighter squadron, now remember, about 8 or 9 carriers worth of airplanes are doing all kind of damage to the homeland of Japan, different airfields. We were attacking the Kisarasu Naval Air Station, which was where about Narita is today, and it was a piece of cake. But our fighter squadron shot down 72 airplanes that day of Japanese, a lot of training. But what it did was, it was 72 airplanes that couldn't come down and defend Iwo Jima. And now we were down there later. Now I mentioned I was on the Hancock. The reason I was on the Hancock is because the Kamikaze damage at Ticonderoga was so bad, we had to leave the fleet that day, and then take care of the wounded, and bury the dead over the side the next day. That was pretty grisly. Everyone got there, like 4.5 hours. You're standing at attention with a couple of breaks in between. Every departed soul got his blessing. But when the ship got back, it was so badly damaged, had to return to Bremerton, Washington. So what happened was the air group that was on the Hancock had been badly demoralized, and so they were about ready for their rotation back home anyway. So we swapped out. We went aboard their ship. They went aboard our ship for transport home. We were continuing the war because our war wasn't over. We had 2 more months to go. So we went January, February, March on the Hancock, which meant we were going up to Japan. We were at Iwo Jima. I remember it's a rotten little coral island. Well, it was the most heavily defended island in the whole Pacific. There must have been 30,000 Japs on that island, dug into caves everywhere. And at Suribachi, which was at one end, they had rifles or weapons firing down along the beach on that axis. Well, our job was now, you couldn't dive bomb that Suribachi. The bombs would bounce off. You got an angle. So we were tasked with delivering napalm. You just fly straight in and go right in, practically hit and then break away and splash napalm into the caves to burn out the Japs. That's how we did it. But getting back to Iwo Jima, it was one of the toughest islands to get secured, but we needed them because we could now not necessarily, we needed to provide escorts for the B-29s, which were going to stop the war, and the B-29s did. But the B-29s originally launched from India, and we needed a support base. I don't think they had escorts coming out of India. I'd have to check that out. But the capture of Saipan and Tinian provided a base from which the B-29s could operate into Japan. But they also are vulnerable because they didn't have any escorts. We didn't have long-range fighters, which is why we had to get Iwo Jima to put fighters there that could then join up at a point, quite a ways. Now, the B-29s obviously had the range to go all the way to Japan and come back. But they felt more secure if they had escorts.
Along with being involved with Iwo Jima, Chuck was also aware of and played a major part in dropping the firebombs in Japan.
And they figured out by duplicating a few square miles of the Japanese construction in Tokyo, the wood and the highly flammable materials. So they figured out what it would take in the United States. They built a mini portion of Tokyo, several square miles, and ran tests of what would be the best method of burning the city. So that's why we get into firebombing, because you had a mindset that was going to fight to the last person. If that invasion ever took place, there would have been 1 million people. I would have been back on that second tour because I was recycled already after April, retraining a whole new group as a seasoned veteran. We were all set to go back on a new ship with a steel deck, the Kamikaze that mounts off, Franklin D. Roosevelt. We were getting checked out on that. But then the bomb was dropped, and then 2 bombs. But no one talks much about the second bomb. And they ran out of gas because they had to land at Okinawa on the way back home, and they ran out of gas taxiing in from the airfield. That's how close it was. Because when they finally got in the air with their bomb, they discovered they had a faulty transfer pump and couldn't transfer about 700 or 800 gallons from one tank to another. So they were short. They had the gas, but they couldn't transfer it. So they were going to run short or crash land somewhere. But they already had the second bomb with them, so they weren't going to come back and return with it. So it was kind of a harrowing story. Yeah, that was. Now I remember I was in the South China Sea. Well, that event was that was on the 12th. The day we sank about 41 or 2 ships that I never heard about. So years and years later, that's one of 5 pieces that blew up from a destroyer that my friend, who never hit anything he managed to hit that day, hit the magazine. This destroyer blew up right in my face because I was going down about 800 feet, which is way below normal, and I could have gotten killed.
After the explosion, 5 pieces of shrapnel buried themselves into the cylinders of the plane, causing the residual oil to leak out.
Turns out that the residual oil was leaking quite extensively on my airplane. Everyone left me. I was blowing white smoke, and my gunner and I ran out of cigarettes after about the first cigarette on the way home of about a 2.5-hour flight, all by ourselves in the South China Sea.
Chuck realizes that he and his gunner are now stranded with no one around to help them. The only thing to do at that point was to hurry back to their ship. However, neither knew if they would have enough oil to make the journey back.
My only gauge that I was worried about was the oil pressure gauge, because I'm leaking oil, not a lot, but some. So you're kind of like, all right, we do have a 2-man raft. We have a concern to, get back to the fleet. Obviously, we don't want to be sitting in a raft out here in Japanese territory. So I was quite concerned. I had the RPM brought way back to about 1,600. Keep it slowed down, so I was doing about maybe 130 knots as opposed to probably 170 cruise on the way home. So it was a long flight. It just seemed longer. Probably one of the longest flights.
As they begin to lose more and more oil, Chuck and his gunner begin to fear what will happen if they don't make it back to the Ticonderoga in time. Just as hope begins to diminish, they see 2 ships come onto their radar.
So finally, you're only because the oil pressure, once it starts dropping, then you're going to have maybe a few more minutes. It's like your engine's going to quit when it runs out of oil. So fortunately, I saw the screen showed up, so I knew I was back near the fleet, so I worked my way over to where my carrier should have been. And of course, now all those guys have got back at least 45 minutes before I did, or more, and they had the whole deck spotted aft for the next strike. So I'm sitting there, where am I going to land?
This feeling of safety quickly vanished once Chuck realized that he would be unable to land on his ship.
So I check in with the frequency number. Stand by. And I said, well, hey guys, here I did a great job getting this airplane back here. I guess, but I felt a little bit safer now, because if it quit, I'd be among friends. I could land next to a destroyer and not feel like I'm. So that was a relief at the moment. Then I said, well, hey, let's find me a deck so that we get on a deck, save the airplane. I don't mind going swimming, but if we can save the airplane. So it turns out that they gave me a deck on the Essex. So it's about 85 it's almost 90 degrees out of the wind line. Well, I knew damn well that there was no way this huge ship is going to turn, but you don't argue with the ship or the captain, you just get down there.
Chuck begins to fear that he will run out of oil before he is able to turn the plane a full 90 degrees in order to land onto the carrier.
So I said, well, sure enough, I said, it's going to quit. As soon as I eased the throttle up, I pulled the wheels up. I said, I just know it's going to quit now.
Chuck makes it onto the carrier with a minimal amount of oil remaining in his plane. Next, he goes to find the captain of the Essex, who tells him he must spend the next few days in the ready room until his plane is repaired.
I went up to the captain, want to know what happened. He says, well, you're not in the uniform of the day, Lieutenant. You'll have to stay in the ready room until your plane is repaired, which I know is going to take a couple of days, but I was all set. I had my 38, but you don't shoot a Navy captain as a lieutenant junior grade. He's telling me I got to go stay in a. Well, it's not the end of the world because you can get a blanket and you got reclining chairs and there's food 24 hours a day. And but I thought that was pretty shabby. Here I'm fighting this war. I'm in my khaki flight suit, maybe a little bit sweaty. You know, that's my job. That's you can't be wearing, you know, your collar with your devices and your khakis. So I spent a couple of miserable days. Not miserable, but anyway. So the day after that, one of the Marines said, "Wait, Lieutenant Downey, why don't you? What can you tell us about your airplane? We really want to know how long you could have stayed up." So I said, "Well, it's about time. I don't want to go down and bother the guys working on my airplane, make them think I'm impatient, and I'm not." I said, "I could stay here a couple of days as long as they're going to repair my airplane. And but I'll mosey on down and see what happens." So I ran into a first-class mech that was working with two guys on my airplane. I said, "Well, I'm glad to see. I'm pleased that you're working on it. I'm not here to pick on, to do any more than ask. Since you checked on the oil system, how much oil? How long do you think I could have stayed flying?" He says, "Well, we think anywhere between 9 and 11 minutes." Wow, that was pretty close.
Chuck experienced nearly everything throughout his time in the war, from his ship being hit by a kamikaze to nearly running out of oil in his plane while flying around in the middle of the ocean. He also witnessed multiple friends die and at times feared his own death. Yet, despite all of these things, he didn't allow this to discourage him or give him a negative attitude regarding the war.
I went through a war. I didn't get hurt. I got frightened. Well, you know, but there's all different reasons. But as far as diving, you're trained for it. You go down, you say, "Well, I guess it's not my turn. Somebody else's turn." You just do the job the best you can, and your success was to kill the enemy, destroy his ability to wage war. That's what it's all about. Nothing personal. Hell, we were strafing sailors that got off a ship that we torpedoed and sunk with. It rolled over finally. And there were maybe 300 or 400. So we just went down and strafed them because that's enemy. War isn't for fun. You know, the Marcus of Queensberry rules went out 100 years ago. War is vicious and dirty. Look what, you know, the roadside bombing. You're growing up through it. You were in grammar school when this war started.
With everything he has experienced throughout his lifetime, Chuck leaves us all with advice about how to carry on with wars that our country is involved in the future.
Open societies are vulnerable now for takeovers, and we're one of them. I'm not preaching gloom here. We just got to remain tough, strong, and fight to retain our liberties, not only from without, but from within. That's it. Time up.
What comes to your mind when you think about war? Men marching on through mud, the enemy shooting on our American men, or all of the lives given for our freedom to live as we choose in the greatest country in the world? Before taking the veteran documentary class here at Harlem High School, I'm not quite sure of how exactly I would have responded to this question, but now I am sure. Rather than thinking of the bigger picture in the whole war itself, I now think of each individual's story and what they gave up to keep our country safe. For each man and woman who has fought in the United States military, they each leave someone or something meaningful to them back at home, while they venture into unknown lands to face people who want them dead. To me, it is each individual's story that wins the war. Each veteran, civilian, and family member of a veteran has a story to share as long as they have someone to listen. As members of the Harlem Veteran Documentary class, listening to these stories is our job, and it is what we love to do. Who would have guessed that a boy with an interest in aviation would grow up to become the youngest naval pilot in World War II. The same boy who would become the man who gave up the opportunity to be awarded a Purple Heart because he didn't feel that his injury deserved it. This kind of humility is often lacking in our world, and I am so blessed that I was able to get to know Captain Charles Downey, even if it was just by seeing his face on my computer screen every day. This is just one example of the experience that the Vet. Class offers us, as well as how Chuck has impacted my life. Now when I am asked about war and what it means to me, I will simply answer with my idea that war is about each individual who has risked their life to save mine.